In this video, I'll walk through how I created Upheaval, a 64x64 first-person shooter made in Godot 4 for the LowRezJam 2023. I don't know if this is against the rules, but the day before the jam I put together some plans, including a day-by-day list of tasks of what I'd do each day. From the concept of the jam, I was already inspired to make a first-person shooter in super low resolution, and ideas just came flooding out of me. I had ideas for weapons, enemies, and even some lore and story ideas. It just so happened that one of the themes announced was Invasion, which perfectly lined up with some story ideas I came up with, but I didn't start development until day 1. On day 1, I created most of the basic systems I'd use as a foundation for the rest of the game. I ended up with a player character that can move, jump, and shoot a pistol at an enemy that detects, follows, and shoots back at you, until either you or it die. Let's go through how I got there. First, I plopped together some cubes into a scene for a basic level. Nothing special, but enough to navigate around and get a feel for the mechanics. And because this is LowRezJam, the resolution got cranked all the way down to 64x64. Also, I set the stretch mode to viewport and maximized the window. Look at them pixels. On to actual mechanics. I started with a player character, a cheeky classic capsule collider with a camera on top. I used a combination of composition and inheritance with reusable components for all of the player's functions. There's a component for motion, for rotation, gravity, player input, weapons, jumping, health, hit detection, state control, and for AI detection. As the name suggests, each of these components is responsible for a portion of the player's functionality, and they all communicate together to provide the whole of the character's behavior. All player input is handled by the player input component, and the state machine comes in handy to decide when and how player input is handled by calling functions in this component, and to dictate the flow of information between the other components. For example, in the motion state, the motion component is called to apply motion. Without being called, the motion component doesn't do anything. Going through the components, we first have the motion component. This takes in a direction and applies speed to it and sends it to the parent character body. It smoothly decelerates if the input is 0. There's also a gravity component, which checks if the character's on the floor and applies gravity if not. It also automatically changes the state to fall in if it's not already. Related is the jump component, which just adds the jump velocity and holds a jumping ball so the gravity component doesn't glitch out when jumping. The hitbox component does what it says on the tin, receives hits from projectiles and sends the signal over to a health component, which holds the HP and signals when it reaches 0. There's also a rotator component which, and you may have guessed this, is responsible for turning the character. The last component is a weapon component, which holds weapon scenes and tells them when to fire, because they're dumb gits who don't know what they're doing. I really hope that was funny and not just offensive to gun nuts. Those guys at least might be entertained when I talk about the gun mechanics. As mentioned before, the states dictate what components do when, and when and how input is handled. When in idle, the player can jump, move, or attack, and jumping or moving moves the state machine to those states. When moving, you can still attack, but not in the air. Since this is a first-person shooter, I then moved on to weapons. I started by adding a pistol, and the beginnings of a weapon system. I created a base weapon class that defined most weapon behavior for this and future weapons. Damage, clip size, shot interval, etc., and a basic primitive cube-based mesh. I'm using projectiles, not hit scan, so it also contains a reference to a bullet, another little capsule, and the ability to spawn it at the weapon's muzzle. I did use a raycast, still not hit scan I swear, to help point the bullet towards the camera's center. If the raycast is colliding, the bullet will go to its collision point, and if not, toward a point 300 units off. I then created a hurt box for the bullet to use, gave it collision against walls, and then created a hitbox for the hurt box to hit. A basic damage system came next, and after some testing and tweaking, the pistol was up and running. Now a basic enemy to put that hitbox on. I created another basic capsule scene, sick enemy red this time, and copied most of the same components I used in my player scene. I did make the enemy slightly slower though. But with the way I made the components, all the enemy needed was its own state machine and the ability to detect the player. So I created a detection component with an area 3D and a raycast. If the player is in the area, it turns the raycast toward it and targets the player if the raycast touches the detectable component. I should mention at this point that I'm using 3 different collision layers for all this. One layer for basic geometry collision so you don't run through walls, another for hitboxes and hurtboxes, and then one more for this whole player detection function. I'll probably use yet another when or if I decide to set up pathfinding. Once targeted, the reference is sent to a target tracker component. This is simple enough, it just keeps a reference to the target and its location, distance, and direction. This is mainly to clean up later code so I don't have 50,000 declarations of target distance etc. all over the place. Now that state machine I mentioned, it's very straightforward with all the other components, there's not much for it to do but tell them to do the thing. The enemy starts idle and its state code is literally just don't move anywhere, and if there's a target, move to the chase state. Chasing gets a bit more interesting. Firstly, if there's no target, go back to idle and return. This is to abort all the following code which all requires a target and would throw a fit if the target disappeared. Next, we tell the rotator component to face the enemy towards its target. Next, tell the motion component to move the enemy towards its target, if out of follow range, else stay still. Lastly, while all this very exciting stuff is going on, it'll fire its weapon if within fire range. Did I mention I gave it a weapon? Oh yeah, my code is just so good, I slapped it in there and said shoot, and it worked. Totally didn't take a load of search and replace functions and refactoring. The last enemy state is falling, which is just empty since the gravity component handles that. But creating a state lets me later define custom behavior for falling if I want. Nothing to see here. And that about wraps up what I did on the first day. Tomorrow it's on to weapons, creating more of them, giving them sound, and refining the weapon system. So let's move on to Day 2. The first thing I did on Day 2 is the first thing I should have done on the first. I created a Git repo for version control. The link will be in the description. I'll also be using a new branch each day so you can see how the project evolved and where I got each day. That's also how you've seen so much footage from many stages of development. Now, with that out of the way, the focus of Day 2 was to diversify and extend the weapon system. That means creating new weapons, deepening weapon mechanics, and adding in weapon changing mechanics. It also means one of the most fun parts of development, and my own specialty, sound design. The blocky basic pistol I created is nice for a start and helped me solidify the foundations of the gunplay, but sadly it'll have to go. I already had a few ideas for weapons written down, so let's start with that and get some basic modelling going. That's pretty much all creating new weapons will take, considering all guns will pretty much work the same, but with different stats. However, one thing that won't be the same will be the heavy attacks, and also the sounds, and the animations. Okay, maybe creating new weapons is more than models and stats. The first weapon idea on the list is Bone Pistol. Since I'm going with a sort of meaty, gory theme, it seemed appropriate. My vision for this weapon is something Giga-esque, but more meaty, that literally shoots fragments of bone. The base pistol will work as a start, but like I mentioned, I had to do some modelling. I threw together a mishmash of lengths of white meshes to represent bones with chunks of pink for flesh, and thin pieces of blue and red for veins. I think the result looks suitably gross. I only had enough time on this day to produce meshes for the bone pistol and sinew rifle, but I think they serve as different enough weapons to demonstrate the new pieces of functionality that was added that day. A properly working ammo system with clips and reloading. For ammo, there are 3 shared ammo types, light, medium and heavy. The bone pistol and sinew rifle both use a light ammo, and I got that working in the game nicely. If I find the time on a later day, I'm easy to add another weapon or two. Plus, there's always the weapons review day I have planned. The weapon component holds the counts for the 3 ammo types, and the weapon itself counts down the total ammo and clip when it fires. Upon reloading, the clip resets to its max clip size. I also added weapon switching, which was as easy as deleting the current weapon scene and instancing the next one in the arsenal array held in the weapon component. Lastly, I rounded it off with some procedural animation. Nothing too fancy, just tweens and lerps. In total, there's weapon switching, kickback and reloading. Weapon switching is just a basic peekaboo tween, down then up. Kickback teleports the weapon backwards based on a kickback float variable with a little random variation. There's also a slight bit of random X and also slight random Z rotation. These values are all set to lerp back to normal in process. The reloading animation is all timed tweens. It tweens itself up, tweens a roll to the right, waits, then tweens the rotation back and leaves the position to the lerp. As mentioned, I didn't have much time to work on the game this day, so that also meant I wasn't able to design any sound. I did have some sounds lying around I was able to throw in though. All in all, Day 2 didn't add too much in terms of content, but the gunplay feels a lot better now, and maybe that's enough to call it a successful day. Next we have Day 3. The focus of the third day is diversifying and expanding enemies. As you may imagine, this includes modelling, sound designing, and implementing new enemies. I had only a few enemy ideas before starting day 3, these being a zombie-like grabber, berserk scientists, and chaos creations. These come from the basic story I laid down on day 0, which I promise I will get to when the story day comes. So first things first, let's design a grabber. What even is a grabber? The idea was for it to be just a basic grunt type enemy, the first type you encounter in the game. It has no arms and shambles slowly towards you, throwing tentacle whips. If it gets too close, it'll pull you in with its tentacles and try to infect and or eat you. These are humans that have been fully corrupted by chaos and live a zombie-like existence, searching for uninfected humans. So what would that look like? My first thought is that I've basically ripped off the first enemy from Silent Hill 2, so that means I should come up with something new, right? Anyway, here's the grabber I made. I gave it a few animations, one for a tentacle shoot attack that thrusts out of its chest, and another for a close range vomit attack. A basic idle and walk animation as well as death too. The attack AI needed some work too to be able to choose between attacks, so I worked a basic algorithm together into an attack decider component to select between attacks. This relies on a custom resource, holding the attack range and animation or weapon depending on type of attack. The attacks are then scored based on proximity to their attack range, and discarded if out of range, or if an associated weapon isn't yet able to fire. Like the previous day, life got a bit hectic, and sadly, I didn't have much time beyond creating this enemy and fixing up AI. This is going to leave a lot of stuff to catch up to on the review days. Hopefully, I find more free time on those days. I actually forgot to record any footage for this day, or to create a new branch. But here's some footage I made later of me fighting a couple grabbers. Creepy guys, huh? Anyway, let's move on to Day 4. Day 4 is all about level design, my absolute nemesis. Well, time to try and cook up some interesting locations to play in. This game's going to be set in an underground research facility, so after having a look online at some images in similar locations, I'm going to go with a standard room and corridor dungeon layout. Creative, I know, but at least I have a good idea of how to texture the place. I jumped into Blender and quickly extruded some walls, leaving standardized gaps in which to later insert doors. Separate materials were applied to the walls and floors so I could reapply textures in Godot. I went with concrete panels for the walls and some tiles for the floors. I then removed the standard directional light and turned off ambient lighting to plunge the place into darkness. Next, for some actual lighting, I put up a load of ceiling lights made from cylinders with emission whacked up and spotlights. I think this already adds immensely to the atmosphere of the game. Weirdly, even with the 64x64 resolution, this is beginning to look somewhat realistic, besides the monsters. As mentioned earlier, this also needs some doors to bring it together. I whipped this together with a few textured basic cubes and an area to detect the player walking in front of it. This triggers a tween lifting the door up and deletes the area. There are also locked doors which, well, they won't open, as the name suggests. Another thing I put together is a screen with text on it. I made it so I can change the text of each screen, so I can leave messages around the place. I put one on the door too, so it can tell you if it's locked or not. It even glows different colours depending on whether it's locked. Neat, I think. Continuing the trend, I didn't have time for much else other than that. But I did set up voxel GI, which makes the atmosphere pop even more. Mwah. So, that takes us to Day 5. Day 5 was, in my plan, intended for working on the story, lore, and coming up with characters for the narrative. Since I'd already come up with a lot of story ideas in the initial planning stage, I decided to instead use this day to catch up on things I wasn't able to on earlier days, like create more weapons, enemies, and spend longer designing the level, as well as fine-tuning some mechanics. I still hadn't implemented secondary attacks for weapons, or the enemy for one thing. Though the grabber's secondary attack has been animated, it still doesn't actually do anything. I did take the liberty of editing the story a little though. It was originally 7 chapters, with each chapter taking place at a different level. That idea has been scaled back. The story is still exactly the same, but it now takes place over only 3 chapters and 3 levels. This seems a more reasonable scope, since it only took a couple hours to get most of the first level done. And since today's story day, I'll let you in on what this game is all about. It's nothing groundbreaking, but I hope it's at least interesting. The player character starts the game by waking up in an underground facility that has clearly gone to ruin very recently. You quickly find yourself up against monsters and arm yourself to fight through them. You then meet others and discover this is a corporate research facility into things man should not be tampering with. Along the way, you find crazy new weapons and abilities and suffer flashbacks that reveal your character maybe had something to do with those experiments. It all comes to a head when you face off against the boss and discover dark secrets. I know, it's all pretty basic and similar to both Doom and Half-Life, but hey, it's a jam game. We're not tackling the human condition or geopolitics here. Much. After this, I went back to my grabber character and gave it some sound. It needed some ambient sounds as well as attack sounds. I found some good zombie sounds here, and also a decent sound to use for the vomit attack here. In my own library of sound effects, I also got a decent growl for the tentacle shoot attack. I then added proper textures for the blood particles, and a particle effect and hitbox for the vomit attack. And, since seeing the enemies just wink away when they die isn't very satisfying, I actually created a death state, making use of the death animation I already created for the grabber. With that, the grabber enemy is effectively complete. I then had the idea to create a whole new enemy, which led me to realise that all the other enemy ideas I had were humanoid, or at least bipedal. Is it bipedal or bipedal? I don't know. So I decided to create a creature. My final idea was some meaty, snake-like thing with arms that slithers along the ground and spits at you. I call it the Wriggler. I gave it the standard idle, walking, attacking, and death animations, as well as some sound. The final result is pretty damn annoying, and that's just what we want. Day 6! Okay, these are getting a little bit over the top. Time for some music. Day 6 was set aside for composing music for the game, and of course that's just what I did. Gotta put that music degree to use somehow, right? Unfortunately, like has happened before, I didn't get that much time. On the bright side, this was partly due to my uncle's dog coming to stay for a few days. Her name's Willow, and she's adorable. Just look at those eyes. Anyway, I did at least manage to get some music written, after struggling with some writer's block. I wanted something that was both atmospheric, but also high energy, and that's a combination that doesn't really make sense, so it was hard to get there. Here's a listen to the basic loop I created at various levels. I thought I'd go with a sort of industrial metal, but also a bit of a horror vibe. I also had interactivity in mind because I have an almost allergic aversion to writing static background music, and an obsessive need to always use my self-made Godot plugin, Meta Player, the successor to my previous Godot mixing desk. By the way, if you're a previous user of Mixing Desk and are wondering why it was never updated to Godot 4, this is the updated version. The reason it wasn't uploaded to the same account as Mixing Desk is, well, this is a rant, but because Microsoft decided one day to ask me to confirm my Microsoft account, and my recovery email address is one from 2 decades ago that is inaccessible to me now. I've gone through the account recovery process dozens of times and I've never managed to get it back. It's sad, because I look at the Mixing Desk GitHub now and again, and I see it still gaining stars and people discussing issues, creating bugs to port it to Godot 4, and I'm unable to access the account. Anyway, rant over. Let's discuss implementing the music I wrote. I first imported my plugin and had to clean up some white space left over from importing 2 very helpful pull requests. After that was done, I set up the tree for the song using a meta player for each node. Since I haven't done a tutorial on how to use it yet, I may as well talk about it now. I first exported each layer from Reaper to a separate file, leaving plenty of space at the end of each for instruments to fade out. Back in Godot, the first player node I added was a layer that would always play. For this, I chose the bass drop sound effect. I should also mention that my music is loaded into an auto-loaded Music Manager singleton, so I can call to it from code easily, but also so music can play and transition between levels. The next few also always play, these being the electronic bass drum and the strings. The next four, however, have their volume controlled by a variable in the Music Manager called Danger. This is all managed in the Volume Modulation tab in the Meta Player properties. In order, I enabled them, set the target to Music Manager, set the target param to Danger, set param smooth to 0.7, gave them each a range fade automation rule, I'll get back to that, and gave them each a high seek up speed and a low seek down speed. To explain each, the target node and param define where to find the variable, firstly, the node that contains it, and its name. Param smooth controls how quickly to lerp the parameter to handle quick changes and large jumps. Automation rules define exactly how to interpret the parameter, to either consider it a value on a low to high scale, or to calculate its absolute distance from a specific value. The former increases the volume as the value approaches a maximum limit, and the latter does so as it approaches a point either from above or below. Lastly, seek up and down speed control how quickly the player turns itself up and down. Now I've covered how it works, let's examine how I used it here. For the 4 tracks I mentioned earlier that use volume modulation, they each use identical settings save for the automation rules. They each respond to danger at the same speed, but to different ranges. The screech comes in almost immediately when there's even a little danger. Its minimum is 0.0, so absolute 0, and maximum is 0.3. This means it's silent when danger is at 0, but full volume at 0.3. Since even one enemy raises danger to 1.0, this means the screech is at full volume before danger even reaches 1. The next few layers have increasing ranges, with the synth guitar having a minimum of 1.0 and a max of 2.5. The bass has 2 to 2.8, and finally, the drums cover 3 to 3.6. This is all driven by a couple of lines of code in the enemy script. When the enemy acquires a target, the Music Manager's danger variable is raised by its exported danger level value. When it dies, it is reduced by the same value. Taken together, this whole setup means my music raises in intensity as more enemies target and chase the player. I should also mention another big reason I didn't do more this day. Fellow programmers will relate to this problem hard. I spent altogether too long on a bug I was experiencing with my music. The music was taking far too long to fade in and fading out far too quickly. I spent hours figuring it out. I noticed that the fade in always seemed to line up with a repeat in the music. So I was debugging my player trying to figure out if the fade in code somehow got tangled up in the playback or beat/bar detection code. No dice. I wondered if the parameter smoothing was the culprit. Still nada. In the end, it was one of the rookiest of rookie errors, a single character, a greater than symbol where there should have been a less than symbol. The crocodile failed me again. Long story short, the calculation of whether or not the target volume was above the current volume, and thus the decision of whether to use the up or down seek speed, was reversed. And so, it used the up speed instead of the down speed, and vice versa. Hours lost because of this simple slip-up. Moral of the story:
the crocodile eats the bigger number.
Anyway, once that was fixed, I was quite happy with how the music responded to gameplay. Here's a taste. Day 7. You thought that was going to be loud, didn't you? Because the last one was even loud. Yeah. Day 7. The end of the first week. The plan for today was to work on the level sound design and ambience. Because this is my game and my plan, and I wrote this whole thing, I'm deciding. That means I'm going to finally add footsteps, fix the gun sounds, and rework some enemy sounds. Firstly then, let's fix the gun sounds. It's passable for now, but the pistol and rifle both use the same single audio file, and it isn't even a gunshot. It's a punch impact sound. It weirdly works, but it's going to have to go. So I found an appropriate pistol sound and a rifle sound and tweaked them up to fit the game. I also tweaked the reverb settings in the buses as well as tidied them up. The buses are room, any sound that exists within the world, and music, self-explanatory. I then had a burst of inspiration when I got annoyed at being able to hear a monster outside the room and rolled up a basic occlusion system. It's made out of area 3Ds that map out the rooms and corridors of the level. I call these sound zones. Each sound also has a little area 3D attached, a zone scanner, and it checks which sound zone it's currently inside. The player also has a zone scanner. Any sound which is not in the same zone as the player gets sent to the outside room bus, which has a low pass and compressor enabled and sends to the normal room bus. Long story short, sounds that are outside the room the player is standing in will sound muffled. I also replaced the Wriggler's spitting sound with an actual sound of spitting. The hissing sound that was being used for its spit attack is now used for its death animation. Another glaring omission in the sound of the game was footsteps. I quickly added a footstep system that just checks if moving, counts delta, and plays footstep sounds at intervals if moving. Some nice concrete footstep sounds, and voila, it feels like you're actually moving. Something my cousin pointed out was the lack of reload sounds. I have to admit this was a bit of a blind spot because I couldn't think of what reloading a meat gun sounded like. I eventually settled on some peeling sounds. Your imagination makes it work. While I was at it, I couldn't resist adding a little visual flavour to the whole ammo/reload thing. I added a piece of bone to each gun that shrinks when you shoot and regrows on reloading. I spent maybe too much time on this, as well as adding an animation of the bone coming off and coming back during the reload. I really mean too much time. I even added a particle effect of pieces of bone flying off when you shoot. Really, far too long. Was it worth it? Maybe? Anyway. Week 2! Before I get into week 2, I want to reflect on the progress I made this first week. On day 1, I laid the foundations for all the game's mechanics. A player that can move, shoot, take damage, and die, and an enemy that can do the same of its own accord. And also, weapons. Then I went on to design a couple more enemies, and more weapons with all of their mechanics modelled and sound designed, and a level for it all to take place in. And I think that's a pretty good start. So without further ado, Day 8! Day 8, the first day of week 2. Its focus was reviewing weapons, which basically means taking another look at the weapons to tweak them and add new ones. Day 8 was severely busy for me though, and all I managed to make time for was creating a third weapon and reworking enemies' attack logic so they didn't attack unless they can see the player. The new weapon I created I call the Meat Launcher. It's a shotgun type weapon that fires chunks of meat. Tasty. It does the most damage but is slower to fire and to reload. Classic shotgun stuff. I didn't bother adding a proximity effect where it does more damage up close because that never seemed right to me. Lastly, I refactored the detection system so that the area acquires the detectable and the raycast continuously looks at it to ascertain if the player is currently visible or not. This was so that enemies can always check if the player is visible, which is used to decide whether to attack. No more attacking through walls, which had been a bit of a problem. A small but significant chunk of progress. That's about all I had time for that day. Day 9! Day 9 and another day of review. This time I'm reviewing enemies. Enemy designs, enemy sounds, enemy mechanics. At present I have two enemy types, the Grabber and the Wriggler. The Grabber is a large, sort of slow mid to short range monster that deals heavy damage. The Wriggler is a small, fast, ranged enemy that deals less damage but fires quicker. Maybe it's time for a third. I've been toying with the idea of a flying enemy for a while, so I thought I'd give it a shot. So I came up with a drone enemy. It's just a flying ball that makes an annoying sound with a gun attached that shoots at you. It's quite annoying. Perfect! As you can probably guess, today I also didn't have that much time to work on anything, so the drone is pretty much all I came up with on day 9. Anyway, day 10. All I managed to do on day 10 was change the material of the drone and add spinning blades. I watched Barbie with my girlfriend though, and that was fun. The drone now looks shiny and the buzzing sound now actually makes sense since it's flying with, well, blades. Day 11. On day 11, I created a system of pickups. The game severely needed some reason to explore, as well as a way to actually find new weapons instead of having them all to begin with. So I added pickups for weapons, ammo, health, and keys, crucially, to open locked doors. These all extend a basic pickup scene, which is just an area that emits a signal when the player specifically collides with it. It also holds a custom resource of one of 4 types. Can you guess which ones? Yes, weapons, ammo, health, and key. Each one has its own custom data, such as amount of ammo, weapon scene, how much health to restore, and the associated key for key types. Each pickup has a sound associated with it, and I also added sounds for approaching a locked door and unlocking a door with a key. I managed this by adding a key name export variable to the door scene, and giving locked doors unique key names. Then I created a key pickup, which holds its own key name variable and adds this to the key array in the player's keyring component. The interaction is similar with the other pickups. Weapon pickups add the weapon scene to the player's arsenal array in the weapon component, and health pickups just increase HP in the health component by the amount specified, and same with ammo. Day 12! Day 12 was spent creating a checkpointing and save load system, and fixing a reload glitch, as well as adding a progress bar showing the current health of the player. The save and load system saves player weapons, amount of ammo, player health, opened doors, picked up items including keys, visited checkpoints. The system uses a custom SaveData resource which is fed by the various systems involved upon passing through a checkpoint scene. This scene is basically a repurposed door. It plays a sound when you pass through, then contacts the player and the route of the door, checkpoint, and pickup scenes. The routes update an internal list when an item is picked up, door opened, etc., and saves this data to a resource. When the game is loaded, this resource is loaded, and pickups that were picked up are deleted, doors that had been opened are instantly opened, and checkpoints which have already been passed are disabled. Onwards to Day 13. Day 13, the day before last. The number of bad luck, but in my case, the reverse was true. This turned out to be the day upon which I found the most time to work. Pressure is on. You may have noticed that the past few days I haven't mentioned my plan at all. Well, as they say, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. I was punched in the mouth by a lack of free time to develop, so my initial ideas had to keep getting scaled back until all that was left was just finishing the damn level I made. Story is practically non-existent at this point. The priority has shifted to getting the level to a stage where it is playable start to finish as a coherent and compelling piece of gameplay. Anything beyond that I've decided to complete as extra after the jam in a full release of the game. On that front, I largely succeeded in laying out the level. I placed enemies in rooms and hallways in ambush formations and laid a few traps, using what I've managed to learn from an unhealthy amount of GDC videos and other assorted game dev stuff. Shout out to Game Maker's Toolkit and Architect of Games for having great content about game design in general, with honourable mentions to Jacob Geller and Cinema Cartography for tangentially related content. I managed to forge a path through the level using locked doors and pickups to dissuade and guide the player in a fairly linear path that loops back on itself a couple of times. I introduced this mechanic right at the start with an unlocked door to a room that contains a single monster in a single key pickup. This easily teaches the player that these rooms can contain either danger, rewards, or both. The door the key unlocks is close by and contains health and ammo. This overly positive reinforcement may just overshadow the knowledge that the rooms can contain danger. One particularly mean thing I did later in the level as a red herring was place a locked door in a small room, with a key nearby. Inside the room is nothing but 2 drone enemies. It's a nasty surprise and keeps you on your toes. Besides these 2 examples, keys are placed increasingly far from the doors to encourage exploration, leading the player to encounter more and more monsters. I also expanded and refined the saving and loading system to include enemies. It's souls-like and punishing for enemies to respawn as you do, but I decided it's just far too hard that way and makes the amount of ammo needed quite unpredictable and possibly unbalanced if you keep dying. I refactored the system and added logic to disable rather than delete the scenes that are unneeded on reloading. Pickups, for example, are hidden and flagged as disabled if the loading system sees that the player's already picked them up. This is because if you get the index of an item in a list where items keep getting deleted, that item number is not going to be relevant for the actual full list. Enemies have their AI and gameplay components removed and play their death animations through. To avoid seeing the awkward mass death on reload, I've placed the checkpoints away from enemies. This also obviously makes it so you don't get absolutely wrecked when respawning in near live enemies. Another problem this raised though was the fact that enemies make sounds when dying. This would cause an infernal racket. Creepy but too weird to include. I brute forced a solution by making the loading system tween the SFX audio bus from silence to full volume over the course of a second. If you're not paying attention, you don't even notice the second of silence at the start of the game. It helps that music is playing. I should also mention that I added a couple of atmosphere enhancers. The lights and screens flicker and the screens also error out with random characters. Door screens too flash up with the name of the associated key upon approach. I also created a sign to show area names and added a few of them around the level to help guide the player. I also placed more screens with some vague messages to set the vibe. So I have a level covered in enemies, pickups, and a path suggested by keys and locked doors. Where does this path lead? From the start of the level to each corner of the map, then back to the start, of course. The first locked door you'll encounter will ask for a white key. Oh, did I not mention I added a message system? Yeah, it's just a label on screen with a function that changes its text and fades it out. You know what these things do. It tells you when you pick up an item and what key a locked door needs. It also alerts you when you pass a checkpoint and when you unlock a door. Back to the white key. It's found, oddly enough, very close to the door, in a straight line anyway. You actually have to travel the entire map to get it. The room the white key is in is locked, needs a red key, and is filled with monsters. The room with the red key is, you guessed it, also locked, filled with monsters, and needs a green key. Thankfully, the green key is located close-ish to its door. As you can see, the journey goes from green door to red door to white door. Inside the white door is a typical bunch of monsters after the obligatory stack of ammo nearby, and an elevator that serves as the end of the level. And now,
Day 14.
the final day is here. I've been toying with the idea of trying to quickly create 2 more levels and implement narrative on this day, but that seems like too much to try and cram in all at once. Instead, I'm going to rely on what I know best, so I'll spend the day writing more music for the level. The idea is to create a full song and divide it into sections. I'll continue using the volume modulation tactic for the danger to bring in the full arrangement as danger rises. The first section will of course play at the start of the game. Passing through a checkpoint will advance the section to the next, on and on till the end of the level. The one exception is the music cue that starts after collecting the white key, the final key. This section of music will increase in intensity as the player approaches the final fight. I leveraged the transition feature of my meta player to allow the music to change as the level progresses. Each checkpoint will trigger the next piece, and reloading upon death or restarting the game will also load the appropriate music piece. I also recorded win and death segments for the end of the level and game over, respectively. I had to make some minor edits to the level, such as adding a door to restrict the level to a linear flow. This ensures the player will follow the intended path and the music will trigger in the right order.
Conclusion.
That about sums up the development of Upheaval for the LowRezJam. A hell of a lot of my original ideas just weren't able to fit in the game, due in part to both my lack of free time during development and the potentially unrealistic scope I had set for myself. Plus, I messed up the whole 1 branch a day idea by missing a few days here and there, and pushing and branching too late. But on the bright side, at least I preserved that first day, and there is still a clear progression through the branches for whoever is interested in looking at the source code. It's possible I may have been able to implement the narrative. It's possible I may have been able to implement the narrative, create more levels, more enemies, and add the friendly NPCs and dialogue I had planned if I'd had more time. But the beauty of it is, there is still time. There's still the future. I've achieved a lot in these 2 weeks and have a very sturdy foundation on which to build. And I do intend to build. Over the next few weeks, I'll be working to make Upheaval what I intended it to be. Thanks for whoever decided to watch this stupid little video, and I'll see you later.